Live from the Tanzu TV studio, it's Tanzu Tuesday. Your host, Tiffany Jenigan.
So, TLDR, I did not practice my pew 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 for the last 2 weeks, and Paul is unhappy with me about this. Instead, I was twiddling my thumbs around in circles playing Among Us, which we played now 3 weeks ago with like former coworkers, people from our like lovely community who come and join us. And Kenny said that he doesn't really play gaming as much, and Paul asked what his pursuits are. So, Kenny.
And so I'll kind of tell you another story about the audio thing here in a second. So just to kind of preface it, so behind me you see something that says Bourbon Pursuit Podcast. I've also got some whiskey bottles back there. So I do have whiskey as another almost, it seems like a full-time gig for me is what it's turning into. But I run a fairly successful fairly successful bourbon podcast called Bourbon Pursuit. You can go and get that wherever you get your podcast. And then we also have our own private label whiskey company called Pursuit Spirits. And we recently just launched a new brand yesterday. So that was some fun stuff yesterday. But Paul, to kind of thank you, Paul, to kind of ease your thoughts there. So very early in the days when we were doing our podcast, I remember, I think it was like episode probably like 20 or even before then, we ended up going to interview somebody, and we sat there, and this was where before we actually had like big mic setups and all this other kind of stuff. We've grown up a lot since then, but we used to have like a laptop and a Blue Yeti, and we'd all huddle around it and we'd take turns talking into it. And I remember we used to try to just record through GarageBand, and we went through, did the whole podcast. We get out to the car and we look at it and we're like, oh, gee, we didn't press record. Oh, we there the whole entire time. We didn't even press it. And
guess what I forgot to do today?
Same thing.
I to hit the record button. Paul, why am I so bad? Vacation brain.
Well, at least you could blame it on vacation brain. We were just still kind of really young and getting into it, and we had to make some BS excuse like, oh, we had some technical difficulties, like we got to re-record this. Like, yeah, we didn't want to, we couldn't man up to that. That was pretty bad. It made us look pretty bad. So
it'd be funny if you just like dubbed yourself. Just like said random stuff.
But yeah, so we've all been there. It's quite all right.
Nobody expects me to be a professional, so I'm not too worried about screwing it up.
Well, see, if you, it's all about setting the bar. You know, if you can, you can meet the bar, then you're doing okay.
Exactly. So maybe you could give us a quick rundown on like why a bourbon is different to a rye, is different to a Scotch, and there are rules about what makes one and not the other, right?
Yeah, Paul, you're right on. So the best way to ever think of this, because this is all the whiskey category. You know, you've got bourbon, Scotch, Japanese, Irish. The list goes on. But every bourbon is a whiskey, but not every whiskey is a bourbon, and that's because bourbon is a distinct product of the United States. There is actually legal terminology that is associated with it to actually be considered a bourbon. So it has to be distilled from at least 51% corn inside of the mash bill. It has to be aged in a new charred oak container, whereas Scotch, Irish, whatever it is, a lot of those are actually using ex-bourbon barrels. So once bourbon barrels are done aging at Jim Beam or Woodford Reserve or Brown-Forman, a lot of the American whiskey distilleries, they actually get shipped on over across the pond. Actually, you start aging Irish and Scotch whiskey, because a lot of these companies are now global behemoths, and so they all have different parts of the world underneath them, and so it's just a cycle of being able to move that product. There's a lot of different things that go into it, such as it can only be distilled at no more than 160 proof. It can't enter the barrel at any more than 125 proof. There's also terminology to be able to call a straight bourbon whiskey, means that it has to be at least 2 years old, and it can't be adulterated or anything like that. And that also is one of the big things about bourbon whiskey, is that you cannot add any flavorings or additives or anything like that. So when you hear people nosing it and they're like, oh, it smells like caramel and vanilla, it's because of just the actual compounds and the chemical makeup of the whiskey in itself. It's not like people are actually adding like drops of flavorings into this at all. So there's a lot of good stuff that goes into it, and a lot of rich history. We've gone through Prohibition, we've gone through all kinds of things, the renaissance of right now, what American whiskey is in. So it's a very fun time, especially to get educated and know more about it. And then you can have conversations like these and people are like, this person knows way too much about alcohol.
And I guess another question that might be a real beginner's question, what actually makes a whiskey as opposed to a vodka or another sort of base spirit?
So it's going to be a few things. Mostly it's going to be like vodka in itself is, and these are all kind of like different grains that make up the mash bill and stuff like that. So by and large, you have a lot of things, you've heard of like single malt. So you have,
Right.
That's usually malted barley that goes into it. Bourbon is a lot of corn, there's rye, there's wheat, there's also malted barley. When you also talk about how many times it's distilled, vodka in essence is supposed to be a tasteless and odorless and colorless spirit. And that is why you don't get a lot of the nuances out of different things, because what it's done is actually, when you go and you distill whiskey, you usually only double distill. It means it goes through the common still once, it goes through a doubler, and then it kind of goes off into the barrel. Versus and you do that because you want those grain characteristics in there, because you want those to go into the barrel to start aging and start developing a lot of flavors and a lot of nuances. Versus vodka, what you do is you distill it over and over and over and over again. So all you're left with is just basically pure alcohol. And that's really one of the major differences between vodka and whiskey.
Okay, so it's mostly about the process then, more so
It's the
than
process, and
ingredients?
it's that, and really the flavor of what you're going to
Right.
get out of it. That's why when you pick up a bottle of Grey Goose, it's not going to be insanely different than a lot of other vodkas out there. I mean, except the ones that have, of course, flavorings added to them.
Yeah.
What made you decide to focus specifically on bourbon versus whiskey as a whole?
So I am in Louisville, Kentucky, and I am 40 minutes from 90% of the world's bourbon manufacturing and everything. So it only made sense for me to, when I started really getting into whiskey, and it was all at my fingertips, and really bourbon kind of is the bloodline of what happens here in Kentucky. Now, did I pigeonhole myself kind of and think like, oh, you really focused on bourbon when there's this whole other world? Yeah, I probably did. However, we know that right now the wave of bourbon is pretty big, and it's been a good run so far. We've done a few things where we have branched out into Scotch and a few other places. However, at least I have discovered for myself, I am not a fan of peat. I don't like the smokiness. I don't like that bitterness taste. So
Yeah,
that's why.
I'm with you on that. When it
Yeah,
starts
that's
to
just
taste
why.
like an old bandage or something. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh,
It's hey, there's some people that like it. I don't know why, but there are some people that like it. But don't be wrong, I have had a lot of good scotches that are sherry finished and everything like that. It's just there's a whole world of whiskey out there, and it continues to grow. I mean, across the United States, there used to only be about, I think, 80 distilleries across the United States, and as of I think like 2 months ago, like the new count is like 2,200. So the category is continuing to grow, and you're going to see bourbon being made. And by the way, that's always another misconception. People think that, oh, to be bourbon, it has to be made in Kentucky. No, it is a distinct product of the United States, meaning that bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States, including U.S. territories like Guam. Yeah.
So is there a Guam-based bourbon yet? And
No,
if
there's not.
If not, why haven't you created it?
I'll let somebody else go and create that. We've always said that we never want to be distillers or do anything like that. We have a fun time doing blends and selecting barrels and stuff like that. But I'm not a chemist. I don't feel like going back to school to learn chemistry and learning how to distill. There are plenty of people out there that are far better at it than I am, and we'll let them continue forging that path.
Yeah, we have a relatively new distillery in Austin called Still.
Yes.
Still Austin, and I
Mhm.
think they recently did their first bourbon release. So
Yeah,
they
I
finally
actually
had
have a
it,
bottle.
had it aged long enough. Cool. How does it hold up?
It's pretty good, actually. I was
Cool.
actually pleasantly surprised when we got it. You know, that's the thing. You know, being in part of the bourbon media, it's a blessing to say to be able to get a lot of stuff sent to us, because they either want you to review it or they want you to sample it and talk about it. And 90% of what we get, we're like, oh, okay, let's maybe another 2 years we'll give you another chance. But that was one of the rare exceptions where we're like, okay, this is actually pretty good. Like, we could drink this today.
Nice. So the whiskeys you don't like, then you could make like an infinity barrel, right? Just keep pouring them into a barrel, and then when it's full, close it up, leave it out for a couple of years, and then come back to it.
We could do that. You know, we've also done things of you know, just doing random cocktails, because this is the funniest thing. Whenever a whiskey reviewer or somebody says this would be great in a cocktail, they mean it's not good, because it's not
Right.
good to stand up on its own. And so that's what a lot of the whiskey goes through. It either goes in cocktails or it goes into like a big punch drink during the summer or anything like that. Something to really mask it behind all the fruits or whatever else it is you're mixing it with.
Gotcha. Now we could keep talking about whiskey like all
Yeah, I was gonna cut
afternoon,
us
but
off.
we should
No.
probably switch across. Tiffany, what are we doing news-wise? Given it's the first of the year, there's not really much going on, but we certainly have some episodes of Tanzu TV out there. I think
Yes.
Nate just did one yesterday, which was, where did it go? I think it was Scott Davis. He interviewed yesterday, and that'll be up on YouTube probably tomorrow, because I'd probably be too lazy to do it today. But it is on Twitch right now if you want to watch it on Twitch. And then next week,
There's
on
tomorrow
February 8th,
too.
he'll be doing Christopher Judd. And then he's got, like, coming up after that, he's even got Mark Heckler, although that's 48 days away, so you'll be waiting a minute for that. But Mark Heckler is coming up real soon on Code. Tiffany?
Tomorrow. He's going to be talking about Spring into Kotlin, and that is going to be at 12 o'clock Pacific time. And then the week after, we have initialization with Spring Cloud Data Flow, and that's with Mario Gray. And like their stuff is mostly like focused on Spring related things and them coding up things in Java, etc. And on this show, so Tanzu Tuesdays, next week we have Tyler Britton, and he's going to be talking about Knative eventing. And the week after that, so on the 19th, we have Spring Native with Sebastian Deleuze. So, and then there's still, obviously there's gonna be more episodes coming up. We don't have any current plans on a vacation time again. We already missed 2 weeks of actual like talking about tech things. So back into the whole like new year, and I guess happy 2021 people, we made it.
Oh yeah, Happy New Year. We didn't even say that. Happy New Year, everyone.
Hit that reset button.
Right? Oh, we should figure out if we're gonna do like seasons, and if we need to start splitting them out. Oh, that sounds like too much hard work. Never mind. Cool.
Why do
So
you like
is that all we need to cover? Should we dive into our content?
Yeah, just I guess basically go to tanzu.tv for all the crazy episodes that we have all throughout the week, every week, pretty much.
Yeah, that's right. Everything ends up on there if you want to look at the old episodes and stuff. And then, of course, if you want to be notified when we're streaming, which is almost every day right now, you can go to Twitch, and our account is VMware Tanzu, and there's like a follow or subscribe or friend or
I think it's a
something
little
button
heart
you're supposed
or
to hit.
something.
Yeah, so go ahead and do that, and that way you'll get those annoying emails that you send straight to the spam filter.
Sounds good. All right, cool. How about we kick it off to Kenny and let him either like talk a little bit about like what he does and what he's going to be talking about it, and you and I can shut our pie holes.
Sounds like a plan.
Sounds good. I'll go ahead and share and take it over.
Sounds good.
All right. So thank you all again for taking some time and Well, hey, starting off talking about whiskey, that's the fun part, for, at least for me. And when I'm not talking about whiskey or sipping whiskey, I'm also talking about Vsphere with Tanzu. And this is one of the projects that, well, should I say, used to be called Project Pacific about a year or so ago, and it developed into what was called Vsphere with Tanzu. And what we're going to do is look at a demo of actually getting into it, but and I'm not going to bore you a lot of these slides. There's a ton of slides on here, but there's only about like maybe 7 or 8 that I want to hit on, mostly because of either context or architectural things. So when we actually dive into the demo and we start digging around and looking at YAML markups, and we look at the way it's all built and how a cluster looks, like how is it getting there and what's it doing? So we'll spend some time kind of doing that. So just quickly about who I am again. So I am a senior technical product marketing manager here at VMware, focused on Tanzu Kubernetes Grid as well as Vsphere Tanzu, and I do a few different things with inside of open source. I saw Paul had a Harbor t-shirt on. I actually got my Harbor hoodie on at the same exact time, and I consider myself a former Vsphere admin turned a container advocate, because I had been doing Vsphere, just pure Vsphere, back in the VI3 days, and ESX 3.0, even before they had ESXi. And I had really kind of forged a path of being able to focus a lot on Vsphere, and I was blogging a lot and really became, I wouldn't say, I'm not trying to say I really became known, but I spent a lot of time doing that. And I spoke at VMworld for my first time back in 2010, and spoken at a lot of VMworld since then. And it was a real great opportunity to be able to kind of like expand out into the greater VMware footprint. I ended up authoring a chapter in a book on vCloud Director when that was more of a mass market item. And up until I think now 3 years ago is when I actually finally joined VMware, but I have been doing VMware technology for a very, very long time. But prior to then, I had been given a chance to, or should I say, I had gotten to the point where I think most VI admins get to at somewhere, where you've learned a lot of things that are inside of the VMware portfolio, and you're like, okay, well, what's next? What should I be doing? This is around like 2010-ish timeframe, maybe probably 2012-ish timeframe, when the word DevOps really started kind of coming around. And at that time, you actually had to know like Ruby and very basic portions of it to start using infrastructure as a service and everything like that. And so I said, okay, I have a background a little bit in development. Let me just kind of double down on this and really get into it. And so I spent some time really getting into, again, getting more into Ruby, and then Rails, and then Node.js, and then finally into Golang, where I had been recruited to actually start one of the first open source teams with inside of EMC at the time. And we had a really great opportunity with inside of that team to really start saying, what does open source mean to EMC? And our team at the time actually wrote the first Docker volume driver for AWS. This is when the Docker volume driver was just in its infancy, is actually in beta, wasn't even in the production code yet. And from there, it became a few different other projects that eventually, we'll even fast forward a few more years, turned into what is today's CSI driver. So our team had a hand in really the shaping and forming of what that was actually looking like. Then coming over to VMware, I was on the Kubernetes release team from versions 1.12 to 1.16 as the enhancements lead. So kind of figuring out what's going in, and then I guess setting up red flags or flares to all of the other SIGs if something wasn't going to make it, or if somebody's just not being responsive for their particular enhancement. And as we had mentioned already, I do a lot of stuff with Bourbon on the side, so you can go check out Bourbon Pursuit wherever you get your podcasts if that's what you want to do. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Kendrick Coleman. So getting into Vsphere Tanzu, I'm going to touch on a few different things and really why this matters. First is really looking at the convergence between a self-service and a developer aspect, as well as a Vsphere admin being able to control the environment. And this is for a few things. We want to be able to enable Vsphere administrators to start picking up and utilizing Kubernetes on day one. I think that's one of the biggest benefits we see at VMware, being able to put a lot of the Kubernetes I guess you'd say, concepts and the technology inside of vSphere is because as soon as we turn that on, we take the hundreds of thousands of customers that we have around the globe and we turn them into Kubernetes customers. And this is where we have to make it easy enough that a vSphere administrator can get ramped up relatively quickly, but they don't need to know everything about Kubernetes. What they need to know about is, what does a Kubernetes cluster, or what does a Kubernetes object, and how does that relate into my vSphere environment? And so we'll look at some of those different concepts as we start going through here. So as a vSphere administrator, I can start carving out my infrastructure, and I can set role-based access control. I can set what images are being able to be accessed by certain clusters. And then the developers or whoever is going to be self-servicing from here, they can actually go through and create their own clusters. They can own lifecycle management. It's not on the vSphere team or some other infrastructure team to actually know and be like, okay, here's a new technology, go figure out how to run it. We all know that a lot of this technology comes from developers, or it comes from really the people that are on the cutting edge or the bleeding edge side of things. And so as somebody that wants to own and run and operate a Kubernetes cluster, they can do that on their own. And so they can deploy it and they can support it at the same exact time. Now, one of the other things that vSphere Tanzu is one piece of the puzzle here, because we have a lot of these other acronyms that we've thrown around all kinds of places within inside of our walls here. And we needed to make it a way that's a little bit more consumable to the end customer. And that is where we started coming up with Tanzu editions. And so today we're really gonna be focused on what kind of like Tanzu Basic is, and where it's really just gonna be the basic components of getting a Kubernetes cluster up and running. We also have Tanzu Standard, which is available, which adds even more capabilities and adds into things like Tanzu Mission Control to be able to do backup and recovery and do conformance testing and a lot of other different things. And then we also have other things that are on the horizon. We've announced Advanced and Enterprise. Advanced is currently available for booking, if I'm not mistaken, which even adds more things in regards to application development as well. And so here's just, let me go ahead and here's the slide that really kind of starts making sense between basic and standard. So when we start looking at the different capabilities between each, this is where it's all going to start coming in. So we have a few different things at the very top. I'll just kind of start there. So you have this idea of, you see the asterisk next to Registry Service and Vsphere Pod Service. We have the ability to deploy vSphere Tanzu with or without NSXT. If it's without NSXT, then the Registry Service and the Vsphere Pod Service are not going to be available, because there's this thing called the Vsphere Pod Service, and I'll kind of show you what that is here in a little bit, but that is the ability to actually run pods natively on the hypervisor itself, these kind of like lightweight containers, and that's only available today through NSXT. We remove NSXT and that capability is not there. However, you do have the ability to use the standard virtual distributed switch to be able to do pretty much anything to actually deploy Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters on top of vSphere. We utilize Cluster API as the main workhorse in being able to do lifecycle provisioning and lifecycle management. And I'm sure that anybody that's been in Kubernetes for a little while, you know what Cluster API is. Harbor is automatically out of the box for your image registry. So you get, you're entitled to that as you want to start going through it. At the very top here, I also have this idea of Registry Service that is in a asterisk. The Registry Service is actually a natively built Harbor service that is a one-click button deploy. However, it utilizes the vSphere Pod Service to bring it up. So if you don't have the vSphere Pod Service, then you don't have the Registry Service. On the container networking side, we support Antria and Calico. By default, Antria comes out of the box. Calico was there because it was one of the first ones that had been approved as a part of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. However, Antria is really the way that we start going forward, and it is the default when you start provisioning these. We also have a few different load balancing mechanisms that are available with inside of here. You will see load balancing become a bigger kind of like ever-changing thing with inside of this particular suite, with inside of vSphere Tanzu, because it was built as a kind of pluggable architecture. So today we'll be looking at utilizing HA Proxy as an open source alternative to utilizing the load balancer mechanism. You will be seeing things in the very future of utilizing NSX load balancers that is going to be as a part of Tanzu Basic as a part of this as well. And that's all going to be simply swapped out because it is running in a pluggable type of fashion. If you're needing some type of ingress controller, contours available as Tanzu standard. When you look into observability, we do provide FluentBit and FluentD resources, actually packaged and signed binaries, as well as getting support on those. And if you want to visualize it, you also have Prometheus and Grafana on the Tanzu standard side. On the operating system side, we do supply Photon OS images. Very, very shortly, we will be supplying Ubuntu images for Tanzu standard. And we also will be soon supplying a script where you can bring your own image, because we know that there are customers out there that have RHEL contractors, you have standardized on SUSE, whatever it is, we will be able to support that in a very near future. On the far right-hand side, you see everything else that's there as a part of global management. This is all a part of Tanzu Mission Control. And so these are the types of capabilities that are available as a part of that package. So quickly to just kind of hit some architecture points, I'm going to try to scroll through here pretty quickly. There is the idea of Vsphere Namespaces. Now, the name Namespaces, it's pretty synonymous what you would think with Linux namespaces. All it is a way that we are slicing up the architecture and kind of creating it kind of just in its own little unique bubble, if you will. And so we'll kind of see what that looks like, because this is where you set permissions for role-based access control. You can set storage policies and limiting. You can also set resource usage limits. So if you only want them to be able to use 48 gigabytes of RAM in a particular namespace, you can set that particular limit in there as well. And that is going to be utilized by anything that is known or can be done by that particular by Vsphere or Tanzu. So today you have Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters, you have Vsphere pods, and very, very soon within the next feature release, you're going to have the ability to actually provision virtual machines utilizing a standard kubectl apply and markup language. Let me go ahead and just kind of like pass through here a little bit, because you kind of get the idea. We break it up into namespaces. And this is also the idea of the types of objects and the types of things that we can create as a part of this particular tooling. So today we have Kubernetes clusters, we can have native pods, we will soon have virtual machines, and even later on is being able to specify our own custom types of objects that we want to provision into our Kubernetes environments as well. So let me go ahead and just hit a few more here. I can't remember. That's the thing, is that we've been gone for a few weeks. So I'm like trying to remember exactly like where were all these slides at? So if you see me fumbling around here, it's with purpose. It's because I can't remember exactly where all they were. If you're unfamiliar with what Cluster API is or what it does, this is a way that we provide a manifest or a cluster spec to a management cluster. The management cluster is nothing more than a Kubernetes cluster that is running its own set of CRDs or custom resource definitions. We apply that cluster spec to the management cluster, and then the management cluster is now responsible for provisioning to whatever infrastructure we want it to go to. And the management cluster within inside of Vsphere, we'll look at it here very, very shortly. It's a set of virtual machines. And Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters is nothing more than a set of virtual machines too. So we also have this idea of the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service, which allows me as a developer to go and provision and create as many Kubernetes clusters as I want. I can configure them however I want, just within the specs or within inside of the limitations that I set within inside of a particular namespace. And I'm not going to kind of show you what the markup looks like, because we'll actually get to that. This is just kind of a good overview of like the workflow that goes into it. So as an operator, I will go ahead and I'm going to enable workload management on my vSphere environment, and it's going to create what's called a supervisor cluster, or what we just had mentioned called a management cluster. From there, as a VI admin, I can create namespaces and configure role-based access policies, memory quotas, so on and so forth. And then now as a developer, I authenticate to the cluster utilizing kubectl vSphere, which is a plugin for kubectl. And all it's doing, it's going to authenticate to vSphere SSO. this is by far probably one of the easiest ways that we have been able to integrate Active Directory and LDAP and everything like that into Kubernetes, because there's nothing that has to be done to the cluster out of the box. It's all a part of vSphere with Tanzu. Now I set my context as a desired namespace. I can create a cluster, I authenticate to the cluster, and then I deploy applications just as I would to any Kubernetes clusters at that point. The great thing about what Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is and what it does is that it is nothing more than a vanilla Kubernetes cluster. There's nothing special to it. There's no custom resources that have been applied to it. All it's doing is we've just automated the complete build, and if there's any application that can run in any kind of standard any kind of standard Kubernetes cluster, it is at least within a 99% certainty that it will run within inside of a Tanzu Kubernetes Grid cluster. Okay, we know how plugins work. Now, the other thing that's kind of unique on how this works inside of vSphere Tanzu, it's all based on paravirtual drivers. And that means because we do not inject the actual drivers themselves into the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid cluster. Instead, what we do is we use paravirtual drivers that then talk to the main drivers that are running inside of the supervisor cluster. And that supervisor cluster is now responsible for actually talking to the infrastructure in itself. So that gives you an idea of actually how we're able to talk to different components, such as being able to talk to single sign-on, which talks to LDAP or anything like that. That all runs through an authentication proxy, which of course is part of the authentication workflow that you would see within inside of a Tanzu Kubernetes Grid cluster. The same thing goes for the container storage interface, the cloud provider interface, everything like that. We have different services that are set up within inside of the main cluster. So this is where we start getting into that sort of like pluggable model where we can swap something out and then all Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters can take advantage of it. We also have the ability to provide automatic load balancer provisioning. This was something that was pretty unique that came with inside of vSphere 7. We all know that if you create a Kubernetes cluster with inside of Amazon, okay, well, we can spin up an elastic load balancer resource pretty easily. To be able to go inside of a generic vSphere environment, install Kubernetes on some just generic virtual machines, you're left with basically using Node port as your only way of being able to access applications inside the cluster, unless you had some sort of external load balancer. And it was very much a manual process on how to get all that sort of tied together. With vSphere Tanzu, we are doing our best to be able to automate this as much as possible. So now as a developer, if I want to create some sort of service, and whether it's an ingress service or anything like that, and I need to have some sort of external IP address, I apply that service and it's going to go ahead, talk to my my load balancer that is now injected as a part of the supervisor cluster. It's going to take an IP from there. It's going to provide it to the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid cluster. So this whole workflow is now really done through the supervisor cluster, and we've automated a lot of the pieces of actually being able to get that IP address that you need as well. And we'll kind of see that when we start getting into the demo. We also have some native integrations into vSphere as well as vSAN, and I think there's probably only one more that makes sense here, and that's to kind of talk about the upgrade process. So one of the things that I think it's with good reason, you kind of want to know, okay, once I have something up and running, I don't want to have a situation where I just don't touch it again. Instead, I want to make sure that it is something that I can continually upgrade and continually maintain as I go through here. So new Kubernetes versions are actually going through a subscribed content library. As part of the setup process of vSphere Tanzu, you subscribe to our public content library, and those OVAs are automatically downloaded. Now, once those Kubernetes versions and those new OVAs are downloaded, also to come with I would say a subheading here is that we are not always going to have the latest and greatest Kubernetes versions. Everything is going to be, a .7 or whatever later release, because we typically wait for a lot of the churn that happens as a part of the typical Kubernetes release process. So you'll never see a .0 or .1 release. It's usually going to be, a 119.6 or .5 or something like that that'll come out. Now, once the OVAs are downloaded, you must start then upgrading vCenter, because all of the components are actually coming through vCenter updates. So once you upgrade your TKG service, you upgrade your supervisor cluster, now the Tanzu Kubernetes clusters themselves, or the Kubernetes clusters, they can be taken care of independently. So if you're running 117 or run 118 or whatever it is, you don't need to upgrade unless you really want to. Well, of course, until you get to N-2 and you're kind of at that point where you're forced to upgrade. But at that point, you can download the new kubectl and kubectl vSphere binaries, put them within inside of your path, and then you can upgrade your Kubernetes clusters just by editing the cluster and specifying what version you want, apply it, and from there, Cluster API will take care of the rolling upgrade process to make sure that everything else stays online. And this is kind of, again, what the rolling upgrade process would look like if I had all of the animations kind of showing you through here. All right, with that, I'll go ahead and dive into the demo here. So before we even get into that, I am going to show you kind of what this looks like inside of vSphere. So anybody that is, and let me even take this down one level here. So anybody that is familiar with vSphere, you're kind of familiar exactly what this screen is. When you go through the setup process, you'll be coming through here and you go through workload management. And to actually go through workload management, the entire setup process, it takes somewhere around an hour to an hour and a half of actually going through and figuring out exactly what IP addresses do I need to have for the 3 different kinds of networks and everything like that. But once it's up and running, I apply it to a cluster and it's kind of ready to go at this point. So I can go to this particular, and I can see right here, the first thing that's been created is, and should I say, once it's created, you see these 3 virtual machines come up. And this is, of course, my supervisor control plane or my management cluster. Now, these are outfitted with multiple IP addresses, and you actually have one IP address on 2 different networks. This is because you kind of have a backend network and you have a front end network. And one of these are going to have, and we can see right here, is actually going to have a secondary IP address. And that secondary IP address is going to be the supervisor cluster IP. Since this runs as a multi-control plane Kubernetes cluster, this is exactly what this looks like. It's 3 control planes for Kubernetes. And this is the one IP address that then is the one that talks to all of them. So if you go through a rolling upgrade process, supervisor control plane VM number 2 might no longer be the one that's the elected the leader. It might choose over to 1 or 1 over to 3, but that IP address will stay consistent through the rolling upgrade process. So once you have that up and running, then it's time to actually start going through the workload management side, and we can start saying, okay, we want to start creating some namespaces. Like what does this look like? So actually, let me go back here one second. So we'll say we want to create a namespace. Actually, even before then, I'll kind of show you as well, content libraries. The one thing I said we had to sync up. So before you go through even the setup process, you go through, you click create. The web address is already available on our docs and everything like that. So you'd come in here, set it up, and it would start syncing. As we can see, these are all of the OVAs that are available to us. We can see that it looks like the latest one right now is 118.5. So that is the current version, that is the latest available that we have for Kubernetes clusters that you could provision on here. So let me go back over to here and we'll just kind of look what's it look like to actually create a new namespace. So we already have one namespace that's created, but I'll kind of show you exactly what it would look like to come through here. It's pretty simple. We would just say, we can just give it any name, Tanzu, we'll say TT for Tanzu, or TT for Tanzu Tuesday. The network in itself is something that I had provisioned as a part of the original setup, exactly like how it's going to connect and how it's going to talk to all the control plane VMs and so on and so forth. But seeing how easy is, all I did is create a name. I'm not going to go through and create it. Instead, what I'll do is actually go through this particular namespace and kind of show you some of the pieces that are inside of it. So coming to the summary side, we do a few different things. First is you say, I want to manage the permissions. So I would just come through here and it's simple role-based access control. Who can edit and who can view. And all it's doing is it's connecting into an SSO domain, which can be connected to LDAP or can be connected to your Active Directory. So very, very simple on being able to figure out how do we divide, or how do we segregate our users, our business units, our application owners, whatever it is, into vSphere namespaces. So once we have the permission set, then we can do a few different things. So first is we go and we set the storage. There's plenty of things I could show with inside of here of setting storage and storage policies, but it's a vSphere concept that you would go through, and you have different types of data stores. So maybe you have stuff that's fiber channel, NFS, iSCSI, vSAN, and you name it, whatever looks like a vSphere data store, you need to apply some type of storage policy to it. And what's that policy is then raised up inside of here, and you can select whatever it is you want. So we can see that this Kubernetes storage policy is applied to my vSAN data store. And we'll also see that this Kubernetes storage policy is then going to be mapped into Kubernetes itself too. And if I wanted to figure out, well, all right, I know that I don't want developers to run rampant inside my infrastructure. I need to set limits on really what they can provision. And this is where I do it with inside of here. So I can say, well, I only want them to have, we'll say even 50 gigabytes worth of storage to actually provision. And I'm not going to show it in this particular demo. I've done it plenty of times before, but if you do hit a limit, you will get kind of what you would see like an error with inside. If you try to do like a describe on a pod or an object or something like that, you will get an error that says that it's actually out of resources and it's out of limits. And this is all coming from here. So you can set these type of limits with inside of any namespace that you want to do as well. And since I already have one Tanzu Kubernetes cluster up and running, we'll look at that in a minute, but this is, again, just a nice high-level overview of what that looks like. So as a vSphere administrator, my job is done. I have kind of carved up the environment, and I can hand it over, and I would say, hey, whoever wants to have access to this environment, come over here, come to this particular, let me pull it up real quick, come over to this particular web page, download these CLI packages, and you can go and authenticate into the environment. So this is what I've done exactly over here. So I'm going to kind of show you exactly how I've got all that sort of set up too. So with inside of here, I haven't authenticated anything yet, but I kind of want to just show you exactly what this looks like. Apologies about that. I've got my phone connected to my other Bluetooth, and it was hitting my phone there real quick. So anyway, the first thing I want to do is I want to authenticate to my supervisor cluster. So I've already got my my supervisor cluster IP inside of here, so I can see this is what I'm going to connect to. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect to it. And when I do this, I can see that I have access to these following contexts. And since this was the namespace that I had created, that's exactly what I want to do. So I'll say kubectl config use context and whoops, and this particular namespace. So I switch to this context. Now, there's a few things that I can do from here. And like say, I want to look at what Kubernetes versions are available to me as an administrator. So I'll say kubectl get Tanzu Kubernetes releases. I think it's TKR. So remember what we looked at before about the subscribed content library? So I can do that as an administrator now, and I can see exactly like, oh, I don't have to go guess. I don't need access to the vSphere environment. Instead, what I can do is I can come through here and I can see exactly what versions are available to me. All right, cool, like easy enough. That's exactly what we need to do. So now I want to create my first Kubernetes cluster. Well, I've already have one. Let's go ahead and look at tkc.yaml. So this is, I mean, really the bare minimum. This is all it takes to actually create a Tanzu Kubernetes cluster. I mean, this is what, just like 15 lines. It's super, super simple. So we set exactly the namespace where we wanted to go to. What do we want our cluster to be called? What's the version? And you can see that I don't even need to utilize the full version. What it's going to do is if I say version 1.18, it's going to utilize the latest version of 1.18, which would be 1.18.5 in this particular case. Setting the control plane count, the worker count, I'm sure you all know what that means. Now the next part.
Best effort, extra small sounds like my work ethic.
Exactly.
And my size, I'm short.
I was like, I wish we should all like say that this is about the effort that we're going to put into it. So there's the next two I kind of want to hit on just a little bit. And Paul, you made a great point here because these actually do have a few different meanings behind them. First is best effort. So there's two different options here. You have best effort and you have guaranteed. If you've been around vSphere a while, you know what it's like to actually have resource guarantees, meaning that the amount of vCPUs and the amount of RAM is going to be kind of like guaranteed. Like we're going to set this aside, making sure that it's going to consume this amount of resources without having anything that would interfere with it. Versus best effort, this is typically what we think of in any vSphere environment. We don't set any guarantees. We let NUMA and the scheduler handle everything for making sure that it's only utilizing the amount of resources that are required. And then after that, this is probably pretty plain. It's just t-shirt sizes: extra small, small, large, large, extra, extra large, so on and so forth. Today, this is stuff that these are predetermined for you of what the vCPU and RAM configurations are for each virtual machine class. We are working on the ability for you to later on create your own virtual machine classes. But today you have the choice of different options there. Now, the storage class, remember what I said that Kubernetes storage, this is the same exact thing when we're looking inside of here. This is the Kubernetes storage policy that is now being taken in to your Tanzu Kubernetes grid cluster. So it all maps to each other. So it's making sure that this is the type of storage cluster, or sorry, the type of storage policy that is going to be applied to this kind of virtual machine. Now, you can do some other things here. So if I look at TKG Cube apps here, this is something that I've changed a little bit, because one thing that we want to be able to do for some types of environments is we want to set a default storage class. So for this one, I've actually set a default storage class. Now, I've already provisioned this, and I can see this because I can go to kubectl git, and I'm going to say Tanzu Kubernetes grid clusters. So I'm going to say kubectl git TKC, and I can see that TKG Cube apps is actually already up and running. It's got one control plane node, one worker. Now, let me show you what this looks like inside of the UI. Going back over to my host and clusters view, and I can scroll down inside my namespace. I can see there's the TKG Cube apps, and I can see that there's my control plane and there's my worker. Now let's go ahead and let's change this up a little bit, since I can. Why not do a demo if we're going to do a demo? So VI TKG Cube apps, and we're just going to change the worker count to 3 here. Nice and simple, nothing really crazy, but just to kind of just show you exactly the process if you needed another worker into it. So I just say apply to it. It's going to configure it. Within probably the span of, I don't know, well, there you go, not even 5 seconds, we have our next virtual machine that's being provisioned. It is going to go through the cluster API lifecycle of actually going through using kubeadm to actually add it into the cluster, all of the services and drivers, everything that it needs to be able to talk to my infrastructure to be provisioned for me, and it's just going to be added into the cluster. And so at some point, I'll be able to go to say kubectl git TKC. It might actually say 3 workers on here, but we can see sometimes it might be in a provisioning phase if it's the first time that you've done it. But now that we have that, and I could also, just to kind of show you other things, I can say like kubectl git machines, and this will get all of the different machines within inside here. So we can see here that one is still provisioning, and there's of course the vSphere provider ID, so we know it's actually talking to vSphere. Now, the other thing that we want to do is we want to start using our cluster. I mean, that's the whole point of this, is we got to start using it to actually deploy stuff to it. So the next thing we have to do is authenticate to it. So and I've got a nice little copy paste here ready for us here. So it's just like the last one. So we say kubectl vSphere, we're going to log in again to our supervisor cluster IP, utilizing the username and password that we have set up. But this time I'm going to specifying the namespace as well as the cluster name that we want to authenticate against. Once we do that, we can see that we now have a new context available, and these contexts are just getting added into a kubeconfig file. So cat tkg kubeconfig, this is kind of what I have mine set up as. So it's just being set up into a kubeconfig file. So super, super easy. I'm being able to see exactly how that works. So I'm going to go ahead and say kubectl config. I'm going to use context of my tkg kube apps. Well, because I can't spell it right. Or did I? Okay, there we go. Need that hyphen there. Okay, so now we're inside the kube apps, and from here, all I'm doing is I can just say git pods like I would with any cluster. I mean, this is at this point, this is going to utilize just the basic kubectl command line. I can deploy things and run things just as in as I ever would. Now, typically I show a pretty blanket demo of utilizing like Nginx and like here's a load balancer. We recently did a kind of a POC with kube apps. So anybody that doesn't know what kube apps is, it's a really neat piece of software that allows us to kind of have a, I guess you can say like an app store type of experience with inside of Kubernetes. So let's see what that looks like. I think that'll be kind of a fun one to kind of go through here. So we go ahead and clear this out. Now, the one thing that is kind of unique about Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters is that by default, they come inherently secured, so much so that you can't even provision a pod. And so what we have to do is we actually have to kind of negate pod security policies, if you will, just for this particular kind of demo, and just kind of show you exactly what this is going to do. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to say I want to make sure that this cluster role binding is being applied to kind of negate those policies. I already
like
have
the Kubernetes equivalent of turning SE Linux off.
Yeah, pretty much.
You're not supposed to do it, but everyone does it.
Yeah, it's like it kind of just gets in the way, to be honest with you. And so we already have my Bitnami repo added, so we're good there. I've got Helm installed. And the other thing that I need to be able to do for this is we've all run into recently the Docker Hub rate limiting pull request sort of thing. So we need to create a few different things here. So I already have my some of the like variables that are set here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create my Docker registry secret, my secret utilizing Docker registry here. So now my Docker Hub registry secret's created, and I need to patch the service account that will then be able to pull from it. And I should also mention that this works like 70% of the time. So if we start seeing some pullback issues, then I'll probably just go back and start dealing with Nginx again here real quick. But the next thing we want to do is create our kube apps namespace. Once the kube apps namespace is available, we're going to do the same exact thing, create the same exact secret, but this time putting it in the kube apps namespace. So pretty simple to be able to see there. Next is actually doing the Helm installation. So this will take just probably a few seconds to maybe a few minutes what it's actually going to take here. So once this actually gets going, we'll put a watch on the pods, and we'll be able to kind of see exactly the status and the state of what's happening here. So we can see right now, there's a few different things also that are different here too as well. So of course I put it in the namespace of kube apps. Now I also did change this a little bit. I set the front end service to type load balancer, because what I wanted to do is actually pull a load balancer resource from HA proxy that's running inside of my environment. So if I come over here, I can see that I've got HA proxy running inside here, and that's exactly the virtual machine that's going to be taking that from as well. And I'm also trying to set the image pull secret to my Docker Hub secret, so it will continue to use that to actually pull everything too. So let me put a watch on it and kind of see exactly where we are here. Oh, okay, there we go. Everything's up and running. That actually worked a lot better than I thought it was going to. So now that we have that up and running, we just need to get the service and pull the IP address, and we can see that it's here. So as we can see, it pulled the load balancer resource. It's pulling from there, and I should be able to pull it up here with inside of here, and we have access to it, sort of, right? I mean, we have a few different things to be able to do here next. So just literally all I'm doing is copy pasting from the documentation. I'm not doing anything fancy or different. This is all just from the documentation, actually creating the service counts, creating the role bindings, and then actually pulling the secret out of this particular service account. So once I pull this out, put this over into here, we now have access to KubeApps. Hooray. So now that KubeApps is open, let's go ahead and kind of look in the catalog, like what's available to us. And this is where we have access to all types of open source applications that are available to us. We can choose whatever we want. Of course, what's the easiest thing that everybody always looks at? That's WordPress. It's always WordPress. So coming over to WordPress.
Bad person.
Oh, I know. It's like WordPress is not a cloud native application, never is, but it's just so easy because you know exactly like, okay,
right.
you have a database and you've got a front end, you've got to connect these two. So what does that look like? So we'll go ahead and click deploy. Coming over here, I can just, doesn't really matter what I change it to. Say this is the new Tanzu blog. And we also know with inside of here, we can set any volume size limitations. If we don't want it to create a new MariaDB, we can have it connect to one that's already existing. But we also want to make sure that we have the type load balancer already set. So we don't have to worry about node port or cluster IP. It's going to take a load balancer directly from what we've already provisioned as a part of HA proxy. We go ahead and provision that. And over the span of the next few minutes, it's going to pull down everything and kind of get it all up and running. So we can put a watch on it here in a second, but we can see that it's already taken the actual IP address from the load balancer. It's already provisioned to it. And within probably another minute or two, we'll start seeing these particular pods start coming available. But while I start doing that, are there any questions or anything else that's come up in the chat that people want to know about, or anything fun or fancy?
Oh, we haven't seen anything come up in chat.
Well, any questions you all have then? So there we go. Our first image container pullback. Like I said, it works like 60% of the time. Usually when I was testing this out yesterday, if I give it a few minutes, it'll eventually start running. But
and that's just the Docker Hub rate limiting, I assume.
Exactly. So you can go. Oh, so you get pods. And we're coming over here. We can probably see exactly what it is. So yeah, so we can see that it's done that. Again, this is me also kind of being new to KubeApps, and I think like I have it working, and then sometimes I don't. But again, I tried this last night, and usually like within the next few minutes, it'll restart, and then all of a sudden it'll start pulling the images. And this is also because anybody that doesn't know, if you start running into this issue, this is all hosted inside the VMware network. So it's me and my other, how many employees we have, like 15,000 employees.
Right.
We're all trying to pull images. So of course we're going to hit some rate limiting. But this is also where you get to, if you want to start looking at, say, Project Harbor to get around it, and you can put your particular images up in Harbor and pull from there.
It's even better than that now. The most recent release of Harbor, they've set up the Docker Hub proxying so that
Yes.
they're aware of the rate limits and work with the rate limits as best they can. And so basically you just change your image name, and you basically prefix the image name with your Harbor registry. And if your Harbor registry doesn't have it, it'll go and fetch it for you and then just keep serving it from there.
Mm-hmm.
And that works pretty well. And I think most things in KubeApps have a pretty easy way to override the images. And so it wouldn't be too difficult to update your install here to use that. Probably not something we would try and do live on a stream for the first time. But
yeah, not really feeling it.
Right.
And I find this especially cool since like I've never used vSphere, and Cube-Apps was the first like VMware related product that I started playing with like right as I joined.
I'm glad I could show you a whole new world here.
The other thing I noticed while you were installing Cube-Apps was all the Helm warnings about the chart deprecations. So for folks that aren't aware, the community chart repos have been deprecated in favor of a more distributed method. And so rather than everything being in one place, you go to artifacthub.io and you look for your charts there, and you'll find them hosted by, say, like Nginx now hosts the Nginx and Nginx ingress charts and stuff like that. And so those warnings Kenny saw were just warnings to that effect. Part of the driver for that was the sheer cost that the Kube community was paying for the was going to have to pay, and then also they needed to move it to a different set of buckets, and so there's a bunch of other stuff going on. So they were deprecated. There is a mirror up, and that warning message tells you how to get to the mirrors, but the goal is to get everyone away from using the community repos. And the good thing is with Bitnami, which is other people that the VMware group that do Cube-Apps, they have a really good curated list of Helm charts. And so my go-to way, anytime I'm installing anything with Helm, is I'll go to Artifact Hub and I'll search for it. And I would say 8 out of 10 things I look for, there's a Bitnami chart for it. And if so, I use that, and it just works out of the box. You get that, like, you don't have to sit there tweaking things. You just do Helm install like Bitnami / WordPress or whatever, and it just works, which is really nice.
For sure. Well, that's the demo. I don't have much else, unless you got questions.
Any chance that the Cube-Apps one started up?
Well, doesn't look like it. I mean, usually this is pretty responsive, so yeah, I know. Like I said, you win some, you lose some. There you go. There's all the crash loop backoffs that we love to see. But like I said, that's probably me not being the smartest Cube-Apps user, making sure that I am, putting in my Docker secrets there properly. I've documented it once or twice, and like I said, sometimes it works great, and sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't know why it didn't work this time. But again, I'm sure there's somebody out there that's smarter than me, can tell me exactly. There's probably like I forgot to pipe in one thing or something like that.
It happens.
Yep.
So I guess is it time for our faces to show back up?
Let's do that. Let's bring our faces back into this.
I think the Vsphere stuff was probably more interesting than our faces, but it comes that time.
Yeah, like I said, one of the main things I really like about it, it really does kind of start create that nice delineation. So we got to understand the typical customer, Vsphere customer. They're not huge Kubernetes users. They're just now like even figuring out even what the word Kubernetes meant. We've been around the space for a little bit, and we've grown accustomed to like, oh yeah, just start banging away at the CLI, like we got this. But we have to make something that's easy, that's an on-ramp, and we have to still make sure that we make it easier for Vsphere admins to still have control of the infrastructure. We can't say, and nobody wants to get back to like, oh, okay, let's click a button and we deploy a set of virtual machines that automatically configures Kubernetes. Like, we can build a lot more value on top of it. Yep. And what Vsphere Tanzu is delivering is the ability to still kind of create those boundaries where, yes, the Vsphere administrator, they still own Vsphere, they still own the infrastructure, but now you don't have to own lifecycle management and everything that has to go on with Kubernetes infrastructure. You let somebody that knows Kubernetes that can take care of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely like the meeting the users where they're at. So when you had up the workload management and you created the namespace and then assigned who had permissions to that, that's really great, because folks that have been doing that for vSphere for 5-10 years, however long, will immediately just intuitively kind of know how to do it for Kubernetes, right? Which is cool. And then I would assume that there's probably like Kubernetes API, like CRDs and stuff that would allow you to just do it straight with kubectl commands rather than use workload manager, so that as they progress down their Kubernetes journey and they learn more about how Kubernetes works, they have that opportunity to really hone in on the like config as code, infrastructure as code kind of thing, and sort of switch to something that, you know, looks a little bit more DevOpsy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think that's also one of the goals of vSphere Tanzu is when you saw what it looked like to actually deploy a cluster, you know, it was 15 lines and it was still with kubectl apply. So trying to make sure that you're integrating to the existing tools that you're using is one of the main drivers behind it too.
Cool.
So we got to learn about tech. We got to learn about like different types of like whiskey, bourbon, specifically vodka. You know, I like the whole mix of things here.
Yeah, me too. I just wish I had had the forethought to have some bourbon ready to sip. We could have done like an impromptu bourbon tasting or something.
No, I can grab a bottle real quick.
No, that doesn't help me.
It's like God, I think I have it down here by my feet. Like it's everywhere. So.
Cool. All right. Well, let's wrap things up. Tiffany, any final words of wisdom for us?
Nope. Just a reminder to go to tanzu.tv to later if you want to rewatch this, or if you want to watch any of the other things that we're doing as well.
And like and subscribe.
That too.
Okay. Kenny, any final words? How do we get, so the Bourbon Pursuit podcast, literally whatever podcast app, you just search Bourbon Pursuit.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I always appreciate the plug. So of course you can find me for anything VMware, Tanzu, everything like that. Kendra Coleman on Twitter. And then for the podcast, Bourbon Pursuit, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as we have our private label line at pursuitspirits.com.
Nice. Cool.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining this week. We'll see you next week.
Oh, I have to hit I think I have an end button, right? I have to hit this button and some things happen. And then I hit end stream.